In 1944, the United States held approximately 400,000 German prisoners of war in over 500 camps spread across American soil. Unlike European camps, many of these locations adopted treatment policies that strictly followed the Geneva Convention, including recreational and cultural activities. This was one of the largest operations for the custody of enemy prisoners on American soil. Friedrich Adler never imagined that the sound of an American trumpet would be his first memory of freedom. When the handcuffs were removed from his wrists at Alva Camp in Oklahoma, he expected humiliation, hunger, and perhaps death. What he found was something the German war machine had never prepared him to face: the strange kindness of his captors. On that July afternoon in 1944, as he watched American soldiers arrange chairs in a semicircle in the camp courtyard, Friedrich realized he was about to experience something that would challenge everything he had believed. The Lost War archives would reveal how music became the most unlikely bridge between mortal enemies. The war had paused to make way for something far more powerful. The convoy of military trucks kicked up a cloud of red dust that clung to the sweaty skin of the German prisoners like a second uniform. Friedrich Adler, a former Luftwaffe officer, watched through a gap in the tarp as the endless Oklahoma landscape stretched out beyond the horizon, so different from the green fields of Bavaria he had known in his youth. His hands, still marked by the handcuffs he had worn during the 15 days of travel since the port of New York, trembled imperceptibly when the truck finally stopped. Next to him, Kurt Weiss, a 19-year-old recruit, swallowed hard and whispered a silent prayer that Friedrich pretended not to notice. The smell of diesel mixed with the sweat of defeated men filled the stifling air of the transport. The voices of the American soldiers sounded different from what Friedrich had expected, laden with an informality that starkly contrasted with the rigid German military discipline he knew. When the tarp was pulled back and the July sunlight hit them like a blinding fist, he could see the faces of his captors for the first time. Young men, some even younger than Kurt, with expressions that seemed more weary than hostile. Sergeant John Miller, a burly middle-aged man with a graying mustache, was the first to speak, and his voice carried a southern accent that Friedrich couldn't quite place. His words were translated by a German-American interpreter, but the tone remained surprisingly cordial, almost paternal. The rough texture of the prisoner uniform they had given him still smelled of industrial American detergent. Alva Camp stretched out before them like a small town surrounded by barbed wire, with wooden barracks lined up in precise rows that vaguely resembled the German barracks, but with an entirely different atmosphere. Friedrich immediately noticed the absence of guard towers armed with machine guns. There were guards, yes, but they carried rifles with a casualness that bordered on negligence by the military standards he knew. Some prisoners who had already been at the camp for months watched them through the open windows of the barracks, and Friedrich was shocked to see many smiling and waving, as if they were veterans welcoming new recruits to a summer camp. The sound of voices speaking German mixed with the English of the guards, creating a linguistic symphony that seemed impossible in wartime. Kurt discreetly grabbed Friedrich's arm when he noticed some prisoners playing cards in the shade of a tree. The first meal was served on metal trays that gleamed under the setting sun, and Friedrich had to pinch his own thigh to make sure he wasn't dreaming. The food was simple: beef stew, potatoes, fresh bread, and even dessert. But the portion size was generous, almost abundant compared to the German military rations from the last months of the war. The older prisoners instructed them on the basic rules of the camp with a naturalness that bordered on absurdity: mealtime schedules, task distribution, free time, and, most surprisingly, recreational activities. Friedrich slowly chewed each bite, savoring not only the food, but the strange feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, he had arrived at a place where he would be treated as a human being and not as a war animal. The taste of the meat seasoned with unknown American spices awakened memories of family Sundays, when the war was still just a word in the newspapers. When night fell over the camp and the yellow lights of the barracks flickered on one by one, Friedrich lay in his bed, a real bed with a mattress and clean sheets, and tried to process the first 16 hours of captivity. Through the open window, he could hear conversations in German mixed with genuine laughter, a sound he hadn't heard in months. Kurt, in the bed next to him, whispered that he had heard other prisoners talking about musical performances that took place on weekends, organized by the American guards themselves. Friedrich closed his eyes and imagined that maybe Kurt had misunderstood the conversation. After all, the idea of enemy soldiers offering musical entertainment seemed more like fantasy than the reality of war. The smell of American soap in his clean sheets was the last sensation he registered before falling asleep, dreaming of melodies he had yet to know. On that first night at Alva Camp, Friedrich Adler discovered that there are prisons that free the soul. The second week at the camp brought a routine that Friedrich had never imagined possible in captivity. Woodworking in the morning, English classes in the afternoon, and, most impressively, genuine free time to read, talk, or simply contemplate the endless Oklahoma sky. Kurt had adapted with the natural flexibility of youth, making friends with other German recruits, and even practicing a few words of English with the younger guards. Friedrich, however, remained cautiously reserved, analyzing every American gesture for hidden traps or disguised humiliations. His experience as an officer had taught him that the enemy's kindness often concealed more sinister purposes. The constant sound of hammers in the carpentry workshop created a hypnotic rhythm that helped him temporarily forget where he was and why he was there. The texture of American wood in his experienced hands as a pilot evoked memories of his father building toys in his youth. It was on a Friday, when the Oklahoma heat made work almost unbearable, that Sergeant Miller appeared at the door of the workshop with a different expression on his face. His military boots echoed against the concrete floor as he approached the group of German prisoners working at a communal table. Friedrich noticed that the American was holding a piece of paper in his calloused hands, and his posture was more formal than usual, as though he was about to make an important announcement. When Miller began speaking, the interpreter translated his words with a barely concealed smile. There would be a musical performance on Saturday night, in the main courtyard, with volunteer musicians from both the Americans and Germans. The proposal sounded so absurd to Friedrich that he had to ask the interpreter to repeat the translation. Kurt let out a smile of disbelief that quickly turned into genuine curiosity. The invitation was not mandatory. Miller made sure to emphasize this several times, as though he feared the Germans would interpret the music as yet another form of psychological torture. Friedrich observed the reactions of his fellow prisoners and was surprised to see that many seemed genuinely excited about the prospect. Hans, a former infantry soldier who had lost 2 fingers at Stalingrad, even asked if he could play his harmonica, which he had managed to keep hidden throughout his capture. Sergeant Miller laughed, a genuine and warm laugh, and said any instrument would be welcome. Friedrich felt a strange pang in his chest, as though something long buried was trying to awaken. The smell of varnish and fresh wood mixed with the sweat of the workers, creating an atmosphere that transported him to simpler times, before the war turned everything to ash. During lunch, the conversation in the mess hall centered exclusively around the musical performance. Friedrich learned that several prisoners had been musicians before the war. Klaus played the violin, Werner sang in church choirs, and even the shy Gustav revealed that he could play the piano. The idea that their American captors not only allowed, but actively encouraged German cultural expressions challenged everything Friedrich had learned about the enemy's nature. Kurt, with his youthful enthusiasm intact despite everything they had been through, declared that he intended to try singing, even though he had never performed publicly before. The food seemed to taste different that day, saltier, perhaps due to the anticipation, or sweeter because of the unexpected hope that was beginning to bloom. Friedrich found himself wondering what kind of music the Americans would play, whether it would be military marches or something completely different. As the day moved towards the weekend, Friedrich realized that his mental resistance was starting to crumble in ways that years of aerial combat had never managed. The prospect of hearing music again, real music, not war hymns or propaganda songs, awakened memories of his youth in Munich, when he attended concerts with his parents and dreamed of becoming a conductor. Before the war, called all young men to other forms of orchestration. Kurt noticed the subtle change in Friedrich's expression and asked if he planned to attend the performance. For a long moment, Friedrich remained silent, watching the sunset paint the Oklahoma sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded him of the stained glass windows of his hometown cathedral. The wind carried the distant aroma of American wildflowers, so different from the German roses in his memory, but equally beautiful. When he finally replied that yes, he would attend, it felt as if he were agreeing to something far greater than a mere musical performance. That night, Friedrich Adler fell asleep to the sound of German prisoners rehearsing songs in their barracks, preparing to share their culture with those who were supposed to be their mortal enemies. Saturday arrived with an unusually cool breeze for Oklahoma standards, as if nature itself had conspired to create the perfect environment for the impossible cultural meeting that was about to take place. Friedrich woke up before the wake-up call, his hands trembling slightly with a mix of anxiety and anticipation he hadn't felt since his first combat flights over England. The camp's main courtyard had been transformed during the morning. Wooden chairs arranged in a semicircle, small improvised stage made of military crates, and even a few American flags hanging from nearby trees, not as symbols of domination, but as festive decorations. Kurt dressed with the same care he reserved for Sundays at the church in his hometown, running his hands repeatedly through his blonde hair in an attempt to tame his rebellious curls. Friedrich observed the preparations through the window of his barracks, noticing how American guards and German prisoners worked side by side on the setup, their voices blending into a symphony of languages that should have sounded cacophonous, but strangely created its own harmony. Sergeant Miller appeared in the mid-afternoon carrying a box of musical instruments that made the eyes of several prisoners shine like children on Christmas morning. There were guitars, a silver trumpet that reflected the sunlight like a small beacon, harmonicas, and even a small upright piano that had been transported from somewhere in the camp with the help of 6 men. Friedrich cautiously approached the collection of instruments, his hands instinctively moving toward a light-colored guitar whose varnish still smelled of the American workshop. When his fingers touched the strings for the first time in over 2 years, the sound that emerged was hesitant and out of tune, but filled with an emotion that surprised him with its intensity. Miller smiled and nodded in approval, saying something in English that Friedrich didn't fully understand, but whose warm tone required no translation. The familiar texture of the steel strings beneath his calloused fingertips awakened memory muscles that had remained dormant throughout the war. When the sun began to set, and the first artificial lights were turned on around the courtyard, creating an atmosphere that resembled more of a small-town festival than a prisoner of war camp, Friedrich realized he was about to witness something historic. The German prisoners settled into the chairs with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, while the American guards stood behind them, or sat casually on the ground in typical American fashion. The first to perform was Klaus, the former violinist, who played a Bach piece with imperfect technique, but a passion that made several men close their eyes and mentally transport themselves to happier places and times. The sound of the violin echoed through the camp like a secular prayer, briefly uniting Germans and Americans in a common aesthetic experience that transcended nationalities and uniforms. Friedrich felt tears forming in his eyes for the first time since his capture, not out of sadness, but out of an unexpected gratitude for the beauty that still existed in the world. Then came the moment that would forever change Friedrich's perception of his American captors. Sergeant Miller climbed onto the makeshift stage carrying his trumpet and announced that he would play a song he had learned in New Orleans, his hometown. The first chord of Summertime flowed through the night air like golden honey, each note filled with a soft melancholy that spoke of endless summers and lost dreams. Friedrich had never heard live jazz before, only a few smuggled recordings that circulated secretly among German pilots, and the experience of hearing it played masterfully by his American captor was both disconcerting and enlightening. The music knew no national borders, obeyed no military orders, didn't care about uniforms or ideologies. It simply existed, pure and universal. Kurt leaned toward Friedrich and whispered that he had never imagined the enemy could produce something so beautiful, an observation that echoed Friedrich's own confused thoughts. The performance continued until nearly midnight, alternating between German and American performances, creating a cultural dialogue that no diplomatic treaty had ever managed to establish. Friedrich found himself applauding with genuine enthusiasm when a young American soldier sang a folk ballad about wheat fields that reminded him of the plains of his native Bavaria. When Kurt finally mustered the courage to sing a German song about homesickness, his young, clear voice even touched the American guards, some of whom came closer to listen better, despite not understanding a word. The night air carried the aroma of American coffee mixed with the tobacco of cigarettes shared between former enemies, creating a fragrance of peace that Friedrich would never forget. When the last note finally died in the air, and the men began to disperse back to their barracks, Friedrich realized that something fundamental had changed within his soul. A wall had fallen. A prejudice had died. A common humanity had been reborn. That memorable night, Friedrich Adler understood that music had the power to transform prisoners into people and enemies into human beings. The weeks following the first musical performance brought a gradual but noticeable transformation to the atmosphere of Alva camp, as if an invisible barrier separating captors and captives had begun to dissolve. Note by note, Friedrich found himself eagerly awaiting the weekends when the musical performances had become an established tradition, each one bringing new discoveries and unexpected revelations about human nature in times of war. Kurt had discovered a latent passion for American jazz and spent hours trying to mimic the improvisations he heard, his awkward attempts gradually turning into genuinely touching interpretations that even the strictest guards couldn't help but smile approvingly at. Friedrich himself had begun to participate more actively, his guitar technique slowly returning as he rediscovered German melodies he thought he had forgotten forever. The sound of the strings vibrating under his fingers became a form of unrecognized therapy, healing soul wounds that the camp's military doctors could never have diagnosed. The familiar texture of the polished wood against his chest awakened memories of serenades he had played for his fiancée in Munich, before the war had separated them forever. Sergeant Miller had become an almost paternal figure to many of the German prisoners, especially to the younger ones like Kurt, who saw in him not the enemy that propaganda had painted, but a middle-aged man who shared their passion for music and life. During one of the performances, Miller surprised everyone by attempting to sing a German song that he had asked Klaus to teach him, his mangled pronunciation and heavy American accent creating a hilarious yet deeply touching version of Die Lorelei. The mixed audience of Germans and Americans laughed and applauded with such enthusiasm that for a few moments it was impossible to tell who was a prisoner and who was a guard. Friedrich watched the scene with a mix of disbelief and gratitude, realizing he was witnessing something that historians would likely never record, the victory of humanity over hatred. The smell of American dust mixed with the sweat of men united by music created a scent that he would forever associate with reborn hope. The letters Friedrich wrote home began to reflect his inner transformation, shifting from grim accounts of captivity to almost poetic descriptions of the musical performances and the unexpected camaraderie he had found among his captors. His family in Germany must have been confused reading about American soldiers teaching jazz to German prisoners, about guards sitting on the floor to listen to Bavarian folk songs, about a prisoner camp that resembled more of an international music conservatory. Kurt had also started writing home, his letters full of youthful hope that stood in stark contrast to the grim stories arriving from other prisoner camps around the world. Friedrich sometimes wondered if Alva camp was an exception, or if there were other places where music had built bridges over the chasms carved by war. The paper of the letters smelled of American ink and carried fingerprints of hands that had learned to play enemy instruments with love and respect. During one particularly memorable performance at the end of August, when the first leaves began to change color heralding Oklahoma's autumn, Friedrich witnessed something that would mark him for the rest of his life. A young American soldier, not much older than Kurt, climbed onto the stage carrying a guitar and announced that he would dedicate his song to all the men present, Germans and Americans, who had lost friends in the war. The song that followed was a melancholic ballad about soldiers who would never return home, sung with a voice cracked with emotion that spoke directly to the heart of every man present. Friedrich saw tears in the eyes of former enemies, Germans and Americans crying together for the first time, united in the recognition that war had stolen something precious from them all, regardless of which side they had served on. The night wind carried the aroma of wildflowers mixed with the salt of tears drying in the dry Oklahoma air. In that moment, Friedrich understood that he had found something that war could never destroy: the human capacity for compassion and forgiveness. When September arrived, bringing news that the war in Europe was nearing its end, and that some prisoners would soon be repatriated, Friedrich realized that he was no longer eager to leave. Alva Camp had become more than a prison. It had become a sanctuary where he had rediscovered his humanity through music shared with those he was supposed to hate. Kurt confessed that he was afraid to return to a Germany he knew was destroyed, preferring the strange peace they had found among the fields of Oklahoma. Friedrich spent his last weeks at the camp teaching guitar techniques to young American soldiers who showed interest, creating a chain of musical knowledge that he hoped would continue long after his departure. The sound of German laughter mixing with American laughter echoed through the barracks during nightly rehearsals, creating a symphony of reconciliation that would remain forever etched in the memory of all who heard it. When Friedrich Adler finally left Alva Camp in October 1945, he carried with him more than memories. He carried proof that music has the power to heal even the deepest wounds of war. The ship that brought Friedrich back to Europe in November 1945 carried more than repatriated prisoners. It carried transformed men who had discovered that war could end within the soul long before it ended on the battlefields. Friedrich stayed on the deck for hours, watching the gray Atlantic stretch endlessly toward a Europe he knew was unrecognizable, his hands unconsciously strumming invisible chords in the cold ocean air. Beside him, other former prisoners from Alva Camp shared a contemplative silence that set them apart from the other repatriates, as if they carried a precious secret that only they fully understood. The salty wind carried whispered stories of men who had learned to see humanity where they had expected to find only hate. And Friedrich wondered how many of them would be able to keep the flame of reconciliation alive in a destroyed homeland. The rough texture of the cold metal of the ship's rail under his hands contrasted sharply with the soft memory of the strings of the American guitar he had left behind. The scent of sea salt mixed with the hope and fear emanating from hundreds of men sailing toward an uncertain future. The first sight of Hamburg from the ship's deck shocked Friedrich, with a brutality that no war photograph could have conveyed adequately. The city he had known as a thriving, prosperous port had been reduced to a skeleton of twisted concrete and iron, streets transformed into canyons of rubble, where ghostly survivors searched for fragments of their former lives. The train that took him back to Bavaria passed through apocalyptic landscapes punctuated by cities that existed only in memory, bombed fields where only craters bore witness to the violence that had swept across Europe. Friedrich carried his small luggage, including the American sheet music Miller had given him as a farewell gift, like relics from a more civilized world that seemed to belong to a distant dream. Other passengers in the crowded car spoke in hushed voices about missing relatives, destroyed homes, and a future no one could clearly imagine. The smoke from the locomotive mixed with dust from pulverized bricks, creating a scent of destruction that stuck in the throat and lungs like a physical reminder of the war. When he finally arrived in Munich, Friedrich spent several hours searching for what was left of the street where he had grown up. His childhood home had survived the bombings, but it was inhabited by strangers, refugees from the East who had taken over the property when Friedrich's family was assumed to be dead. His parents had died during the last winter of the war, victims not of bombs, but of the hunger and cold that had killed thousands of German civilians in the final months of the conflict. His fiancée had married another man, believing he would never return from the war, a decision Friedrich understood without bitterness, for his experience at Alva Camp had taught him that life keeps flowing, even when the world seems to have come to an end. He rented a small room in a semi-destroyed basement, and found work helping to remove rubble still blocking many streets in Munich, a physical labor that allowed him to mentally process everything he had lived through and lost. The nights were the hardest, when the silence of the destroyed city cruelly contrasted with the memories of musical performances under the starry skies of Oklahoma. The rough texture of the bricks he handled during the day left his hands calloused and bleeding, but it also gave him a tangible sense of contributing to the reconstruction of something greater than his own life. It was on a particularly dark December night, when snow covered Munich like a white shroud, temporarily concealing the city's wounds, that Friedrich made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He took out one of the sheet music pieces Sergeant Miller had given him, a guitar arrangement of amazing grace, and walked the empty streets in search of an instrument. He found a small music shop that had reopened in a basement, where an elderly Jewish luthier who had survived hidden during the war worked silently repairing damaged instruments. The man, named Samuel, was initially suspicious of the former German soldier, but when Friedrich began to play the American melody he had learned in captivity, something changed in the artisan's expression. The music filled the cramped space of the shop like a shared prayer, uniting two men who had been placed on opposite sides by war, but whom art revealed as kindred souls. Samuel offered Friedrich a damaged guitar, explaining that the instrument had belonged to a musician who had died during the bombings. The smell of fresh varnish mixed with the aroma of old wood, creating a scent of renewal that spoke of future possibilities. That night, alone in his cold basement room, Friedrich played for the first time on German soil the melodies he had learned at Alva camp, the notes echoing off the concrete walls like musical seeds planted in devastated but fertile soil. He understood that he had returned to Germany, not only as a repatriated prisoner, but as an involuntary missionary of a new way of seeing the world, someone who had experienced the possibility of reconciliation and now carried the responsibility of sharing that vision with his fellow countrymen. Neighbors began to gather outside his semi-buried window, drawn by sounds that spoke of hope in a language that transcended words. War orphans stopped to listen, their gaunt faces lighting up with smiles that seemed forgotten during the years of terror. Music had become his way of contributing to the healing of the German soul, one note at a time, one heart at a time, one memory transformed at a time. The sound of the damaged guitar reverberated through the wounded city, like a promise that not all beauty had died in the war, and that some seeds planted in enemy soil could bloom into gardens of peace. Friedrich Adler had discovered that the true return home was not geographical, but spiritual, and that sometimes it takes being a prisoner to learn how to be free. The letter arrived on a rainy spring morning in 1965, delivered by a postman who could not imagine that the yellowed envelope carried the weight of 2 decades of unspoken longing. Friedrich, now the owner of a small music school in the heart of rebuilt Munich, immediately recognized the youthful handwriting he had observed so many times during Alva camp rehearsals, though the letter seemed slightly more mature, marked by the 20 years that had passed since their last meeting. Kurt Weiss was writing from Hamburg, where he had become an English teacher at a secondary school, and his letter revealed that he had never forgotten the musical lessons learned in captivity, organizing a student choir that performed both traditional German songs and American jazz standards. Friedrich held the letter with slightly trembling hands, not from age, for at 52 he was still vigorous, but from pure emotion upon discovering that he was not alone in his silent mission to keep alive the memory of those improbable days in Oklahoma. The texture of the cheap paper contrasted with the richness of the memories each word awakened, instantly transporting him back to those magical weekends when music had been more powerful than war. The scent of morning coffee mixed with the imaginary aroma of American dust he could still smell when he closed his eyes and allowed himself to return to that time. The reunion took place on a golden afternoon in June at Munich's Central Station, where Friedrich waited with an anxiety he hadn't felt since the early days at Alva camp, carrying a guitar as if it were a credential proving his identity. Kurt stepped off the train, transformed by time into a mature man, but his eyes retained the same curious spark Friedrich remembered, and when they embraced for the first time in 2 decades, they both laughed with the embarrassment of men who had shared something too deep to be expressed in ordinary words. Kurt had brought his harmonica, the same one he had played on those distant nights, and when he took it out of his coat pocket, the instrument glistened in the station light like a sacred relic. They walked through the rebuilt streets of Munich, talking simultaneously, their voices overlapping in a symphony of rediscovered memories, interrupted stories from 20 years ago that could now finally be completed. The city around them pulsed with the prosperity of the German economic miracle, but their conversations transported them to a prisoner of war camp in Oklahoma, where they had learned that humanity could flourish in the most unlikely places. The sound of their footsteps on the new pavement echoed like a rhythm, marking the beat of a friendship that neither time nor distance had managed to destroy. At Friedrich's music school, Kurt discovered that his former, captive companion had created something much larger than a simple business. He had built a sanctuary where German children not only learned musical techniques but also the values of tolerance and understanding Friedrich had absorbed. During his American experience, the walls were decorated with photographs of his students alongside musicians from various nationalities, including a framed picture of Sergeant Miller that a former prisoner had obtained through the Red Cross years earlier. Kurt was moved to discover that Friedrich had kept a detailed archive of all the former prisoners from Alva camp he had managed to contact over the years, an informal network of men scattered across Germany who had been touched by the same transformative experience. Together, they leafed through letters and photographs that documented lives that had been redirected by music. Men who had become teachers, therapists, community organizers, each carrying the benign virus of reconciliation they had contracted in Oklahoma. The texture of the yellowed pages in the albums spoke of time past, but the stories they contained remained vibrant and relevant. The smell of old paper mixed with the aroma of varnish from musical instruments, creating a museum-like atmosphere dedicated not to the horrors of war, but to the miracles of humanity. During the week Kurt spent in Munich, the two men organized a special performance for the students of the school, recreating some of the songs they had learned at Alva camp and telling stories about American guards who had chosen music over humiliation as a way to deal with their German prisoners. The children, born in a prosperous and democratic Germany, listened with fascination to the stories about a time when Americans and Germans considered each other mortal enemies, a concept that seemed so distant to a generation that had grown up seeing American soldiers as protectors and allies. Friedrich and Kurt took turns playing and singing, their voices naturally harmonizing as if the 20 years of separation had been merely a long musical pause. A 10-year-old girl asked if the Americans still played jazz, and Kurt laughed as he explained that jazz had become one of America's most important cultural exports, conquering the world that had once tried to destroy it. The sound of the children's laughter echoed through the schoolrooms like an approval from the new generation for the lessons both men were trying to pass on. The afternoon light filtering through the windows created a golden atmosphere that seemed to bless that moment of continuity between past and present. The night before Kurt's departure, the two friends walked to a small park on the outskirts of Munich, where Friedrich used to play on Sundays for anyone who wanted to listen. A tradition that had started as personal therapy and had turned into a small weekly community celebration. They sat on a wooden bench under a tree that had been planted in the post-war period as a symbol of renewal, and Kurt confessed that he had spent 2 decades wondering whether the memories of Alva camp were real or just a fantasy created by his mind to cope with the trauma of defeat. Friedrich smiled and said that he had had the same doubts, until he realized that the truth of the memories mattered less than the impact they had had on their subsequent lives. They played together as the sun set over the rebuilt Bavaria, their melodies blending with the sound of children playing in the park, creating a symphony of normal life that both had helped to build through their professional and personal choices. The wind carried the scent of German flowers mixed with the aroma of fresh bread from a nearby bakery, creating an essence of everyday peace they had dreamed of during those distant days in Oklahoma. The familiar texture of the guitar strings under their calloused fingers spoke of continuity, of purposes upheld, of silent promises kept over 2 decades. That farewell night, Friedrich Adler and Kurt Weiss understood that some encounters are bridges built by destiny to connect not only people but entire eras of human history. The 1970s found Friedrich transformed into a respected figure in Munich's music community, but his true influence extended far beyond the boundaries of his school, reaching an international network of former prisoners, American veterans and young musicians who had been touched by his unique philosophy of reconciliation through art. Letters regularly arrived from the former Alva camp facilities, which had been transformed into a community school, bringing News of annual meetings where American veterans and former German prisoners would gather to celebrate not the war that had separated them, but the music that had united them. Friedrich maintained active correspondence with Sergeant Miller himself, now retired and living peacefully in New Orleans, where he organized jazz sessions in nursing homes for veterans, planting seeds of musical healing in a new generation of men marked by the Vietnam War. The texture of the international envelopes that arrived weekly was different from German paper, but they carried the same emotional weight of shared memories that refused to die with the passage of time. The smell of foreign ink mixed with the familiar aroma of his home, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that reflected the international nature of his undeclared mission. Friedrich's fingers, now slightly arthritic but still nimble enough to extract complex melodies from any instrument, trembled subtly as he opened each letter, anticipating more evidence that the seed planted in Oklahoma continued to germinate around the world. In 1975, Friedrich received an invitation that initially seemed too surreal to be true. The U.S. government, in partnership with German veteran organizations, was organizing an international conference on reconciliation through the arts in times of conflict, and his name had been suggested as the keynote speaker by former Alva camp guards who now held prominent positions at American universities. The trip back to the United States, 30 years after his forced repatriation, was emotionally devastating and simultaneously liberating, as if he were finally completing a circle that had remained open in his soul since 1945. The plane that brought him across the Atlantic flew over landscapes that awakened fragmented memories of his original journey as a prisoner. But this time he was traveling as a free man, an honored guest, an unofficial ambassador of a philosophy born in captivity and blossomed in freedom. Kurt, now the principal of a school in Hamburg, had received a similar invitation, and they traveled together, two 60-year-old men carrying guitars and harmonicas as if they were diplomatic credentials from a nation that existed only in memory and heart. The texture of the seats on the American airplane was softer than any surface they had known during the war, but their hands instinctively remembered the roughness of the prisoner uniforms they had worn 3 decades before. The conference in Washington, D.C., brought together an impressive audience of diplomats, academics, therapists, and veterans from multiple conflicts, all interested in understanding how art could serve as an instrument of healing for collective and individual traumas caused by war. Friedrich took to the podium carrying the same guitar that Samuel, the Jewish luthier, had given him in post-war Munich, an instrument that had become a physical symbol of his personal journey from destruction to reconstruction, from hate to love, from war to peace. His presentation alternated between spoken narrative and musical demonstrations, playing the same melodies he had learned at Alva camp, while telling stories about American guards who had chosen humanity over cruelty as a way of dealing with enemy prisoners. The audience, initially formal and academic, gradually transformed into an emotional congregation as Friedrich and Kurt recreated some of the performances they had made under the starry skies of Oklahoma, their mature voices carrying not only melodies, but decades of wisdom distilled from lived experience. The sound of simultaneous translation could not mask the raw emotion emanating from the two Germans, who had discovered America not through conquest, but through shared music. The smell of new carpet in the auditorium mixed with the scent of old wood from the guitar, creating a sensory bridge between present and past. The presentation culminated in a moment Friedrich had never planned, but that seemed inevitable. He invited any American veterans present to join him in a version of Amazing Grace that he had learned from Sergeant Miller decades earlier. Slowly, men who had served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam began to rise and walk toward the stage, their voices joining in an impromptu harmony that spoke of shared wounds, lessons learned, and hopes kept alive through decades of historical changes. A former American pilot who had bombed Germany embraced Friedrich after the song, whispering that he finally understood they had been on the same side from the beginning, the side of humanity against dehumanization. Kurt played his harmonica with tears freely running down his face, not from sadness but from deep joy, upon realizing that the seed planted in 1944 had transformed into a tree whose fruits were being harvested by a new generation of people committed to peace. The texture of the embrace from dozens of American veterans was different from any physical sensation Friedrich had ever experienced. It was the touch of redemption, of history being rewritten through the conscious choice of forgiveness over resentment. The mixed fragrance of different American men's colognes created an atmosphere that smelled of possibility, of alternative futures, of worlds where war could end not only on the battlefields, but in the hearts of the men who fought it. Friedrich Adler returned to Germany, after that conference, transformed by the certainty that his life had fulfilled a greater purpose than he could have ever imagined. When he was just a young pilot flying combat missions over England, the remaining years of his life were dedicated to systematizing and documenting his philosophy of musical reconciliation, working with both German and American universities to develop programs that used music as a therapeutic tool for war veterans and their families. His school in Munich became an informal pilgrimage center for those interested in understanding how traumatic experiences could be transformed into sources of healing and growth through artistic expression. Kurt visited regularly, and together they kept in touch with dozens of former Alva camp prisoners and their descendants, creating a virtual community of people, united by the belief that music has healing powers that transcend time, space, and nationality. When Friedrich passed away in 1989, at the age of 76, his funeral was an international celebration of music, with representatives from 12 countries playing melodies they had learned through his direct or indirect influence. The texture of the international flowers placed on his coffin spoke of lives touched, lessons passed on, legacies perpetuated through generations that never knew war, but had inherited the tools to build peace. The sound of harmonies that echoed in the Munich cemetery that day carried distant echoes of those first magical nights at Alva camp, when a group of men had discovered that music was stronger than hate. When the last note of that final ceremony died in the Bavarian air, Friedrich Adler had completed a life dedicated to proving that some prisons exist to set us free, and that the true victors of war are those who choose to plant gardens where others see only battlefields. Music has no homeland because its homeland is the human heart, and the human heart knows no boundaries created by war. Friedrich Adler, 1975.